So here and now, you guys are going to get involved in this. It's no more passivity, because next up is the New York Times debate. So before I introduce Declan, who will be moderating this debate and explain in further detail the context of the debate, I'd like to stress that this will be a robust debate. Operative word is robust. And these speakers need your support and enthusiasm. So, but first, before I get you more involved, I want to explain the rules. So listen up, please, listen up. It's a little bit complicated, so bear with me and listen up. This is going to be an Oxford-style debate. We will have 2 teams of 3 speakers. So each team will have 3 speakers. Obviously, one team will argue for the motion, and the other team will argue against the motion. The motion they will be debating is here on the screen. This House believes that fuel expansion is a prerequisite to a just transition. That is our motion this afternoon. Again, we will have 3 rounds of debaters, both on the for and the against side of the motion for each round, and the debaters for each team will come to the podium at the same time and debate in turn, doing their best, their very best, I'm sure, they're fantastic debaters, to convince you, the audience, that their argument is indeed irrefutable. After the 3 rounds of debates, the commentators, we have some very esteemed commentators who are sitting here in the front row, will provide their constructive feedback and reflections, operative words being constructive feedback and reflections, and will crucially challenge the debaters to strengthen their argument in the final round, where each team will be able to choose just one of their team members to represent their side of the motion, to argue their final rebuttal. So the commentators will come up, give their constructive comments and criticisms, give some recommendations, and then one of the members of each team will be asked to come up and give their final rebuttals. I'd like to very quickly introduce our commentators who will be invited on stage after the 3 rounds of the debate. I'm delighted, Dr. Jochen Rockström was here yesterday as the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. I don't think he needs much introduction. Anybody in the climate world knows Jochen. Very honored to have you here. Thank you, Jochen. We also have Renata Koch-Alvarenga. Have I crucified that name again? I got it right. Who's the founder of Empodera Klima. And we have Wanjira Mathai, who is the Africa Director of World Resource Institute. Thank you all for being here and participating. So after the round of commentation, we're going to ask the 2 teams, you're going to have to be patient, we're going to give them 2 minutes in which they will build, from the comments they've heard from the commentators, their final rebuttal and decide who will represent them in the final, to make their final case. And then we're going to turn to you, our esteemed audience, to give you the final decision in this through the tried and tested, highly sophisticated New York Times technology system, which is through your clapping and the noise of your clapping, the resonance of your clapping. So please be engaged, spontaneous. Applause is encouraged throughout. The occasional outcry of respectful outrage is also encouraged. And I should mention, of course, our debaters may go beyond or not align with those of their organizations, their views, for the sake of the debate. They may well be debating, you should keep this in mind, they may well be debating for or against the motion they do not actually agree with in their personal lives. So remember that. The point is, show them the respect, encourage them. We at the New York Times seek a broad perspective of views, a broad church of views, and this debate is in that spirit. So, and I'm going to jump in as the angry person if anybody's breaking the rules. But before we begin, I'd like to take a quick temperature of the room for those of you who agree with the motion. Again, the motion is on the screen behind me. So if you agree with this motion, this House believes that fossil fuel expansion is a prerequisite to a just transition. Can you now applause? Wow. Wow. It's not a surprise. Do remember to try and park your prejudice during this debate. Have an open mind. So those who disagree with the motion and think fossil fuel expansion is not a prerequisite to a just transition, please clap. Debaters. By the way, we're gonna have a little sway on this at the end, so keep that in mind. That's the rules. I hope they're all clear. I hope it's not as clear as mud. I hope it's crystal clear. Declan, I'm going to now ask Declan Walsh, the Chief Africa Correspondent for the New York Times. Declan, can you come and introduce your debaters and come onto the stage and give us a little bit more context? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. For team, you've really got your work cut out for you with this crowd. We are very excited to host this topic, this debate here. I think it's one of the hottest topics actually at the COP. It's a showdown over the oil and gas industry that cuts across issues of fairness, finance and development, and it has particular relevance to Africa. It's been prompted in part by the war in Ukraine, which has sent energy prices soaring and destabilized economies in the global north, while in the global south, developing countries have been crippled by the rising effects and costs of climate change. And it poses some hard choices. For developing countries, should they turn to fossil-fueled solutions to lift their countries out of poverty and into economic prosperity? Here in Africa, we're already seeing it playing out in the forests of the Congo, where the government proposes to cut into one of the world's most important carbon sinks to drill for oil, and in the seas around the continent, where countries like Senegal and Tanzania are pressing ahead with their plans to develop natural gas fields. And the question for developed countries, I think, is, should they use fossil fuel expansion to stave off the political turmoil and economic instability that may stem from the Ukraine war? Or would that approach make a mockery of a just transition, two wrongs making a right that ignores the urgent needs of our main stakeholder, the planet? Leaders need to propose how they will secure the future of emerging nations. If fossil fuel extraction is not the solution, then what's the plan? And who gets to decide? I would like to invite the first debater from the for and the against teams to the podium. Please. So we have Elizabeth Chege, who is the CEO and co-founder of Web Limited, who is representing the for side of the motion, and Mohammed Adaw, the founder and director of Power Shift Africa, who is representing the against side of the motion. You both have 2.5 minutes on the clock for your side of the motion, and I'd like to start with you, Elizabeth. If you're ready, your 2.5 minutes will start now.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Let's not be hypocrites. We flew here, didn't we? We used fossil fuel. We're using fossil fuel right now. So my point is just transition. It was introduced by trade unions, and ILO covered that, because of livelihoods of the people working. We can't just unplug and say, let's move to renewable energy. Let's not use fossil fuels. Every 5 to 10 seconds, a child dies in Africa because of lack of access to electricity. Yet we have the resources. Where's the $100 billion per year? Did anybody get that? Do you have that? We haven't seen it. We're discussing it day by day, but people are dying in Africa. At the same time, the burden is on those who know. A quote from the late Professor Wangari Maathai. We know that this conversation is an extension of colonization. Why can't we use our fossil fuels for a just transition? Africa itself, in the treaty, is in Article 4 identified as a continent of special needs. That translates to special needs in using just transition fossil fuels. We're not saying it's forever, we're saying it's a just transition. But at the same time, who do we trust? We have to rely on ourselves. If we are supporting the colonialists, then we will listen to the point that we can't use fossil fuels, yet we're not industrializing, and we are drowning in debt. How does this debt continue? By talking about investing in other sources of fuel, that we have to get grants and more loans, and we continue drowning in debt. Africa will house 70% population of youth. The youth will pay for that debt, yet we have the resources. Everybody has a mobile phone. Show me your mobile phones. Minerals extracted from Africa. So why aren't we extracting our fossil fuels to keep us alive? And once again, this House firmly believes that fossil fuel expansion is a prerequisite to a just transition, and we start today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. If you can stay there, now we'll turn to Mohammed for the against side of the motion. Your time starts now.
Colleagues, let's just remember that we're in the midst of a climate emergency that has been caused by the rich world's addiction to fossil fuels. But they got addicted to fossil fuels 100 years ago, before we had the technology of renewables. Now that we're on the front lines of climate change and the continent of Africa is suffering fast and worst the impact of climate change, the choice we have is to ask ourselves what energy and development pathway is right for the continent of Africa, so that this continent of Africa can be able to develop and secure its people's well-being and drive its people's prosperity. And I want to tell you this. There is no future for fossil fuels, because what that would do is actually cause the breach of the 1.5 guardrail and put us in climate chaos. Now, how do we avoid climate chaos and still secure the very good arguments around development, around prosperity that Elizabeth made? And my argument is this, friends, that we have a future that can be powered by 100% renewable energy, so that the continent that missed out on the fossil fuel-powered industrialization can become the renewable energy superpowers. Why do we have mobile phones? It's because we leapfrogged fixed lines, and we didn't say we needed fixed line. Any of you will now put aside your telephone that you have in your pocket and say, we will do away with mobile phones and we'll have fixed lines that will be in our hotels or in our homes. Can I see anyone raising hands to elect that? None of you will choose that. We leapfrog fixed telephone lines, we can leapfrog fossil fuels and become the renewable energy leaders. The argument isn't about what the right to development. It's what development is right for the continent of Africa. But the second question is about finance. You've had Elizabeth make the case about the 100 billion. Those are peanuts when you actually compare to the exports of low value added commodities, including fossil fuels, that this continent produces and exports and still imports refined products. Think of Nigeria, our biggest producer of fossil fuels. Did they fix their energy poverty? Did they deliver greater development because of their fossil fuels? The resource cuts that this continent has can only be addressed if we actually choose to tap the incredible renewable energy potential that exists. Our appeal to you, friends, is let's get away from these constraining mindsets and the colonial baggage and chart a new path for the world where we're leaders, not followers, trying to catch up after 100 years of pollution.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those fantastic, a fantastic start to the debate. Two speakers from Nairobi. We're going to stay with another two speakers, another from Kenya and one from Swaziland. If you can step to the podium now, please. On the for side, we have Andrew Kamau, who is the Principal Secretary at the Ministry of Petroleum and Mining of Kenya, representing the for side. And on the other side, we have Thuli Makama, who is the Africa Director at Oil Change International. Over to Andrew for the for side of the motion. If you're ready, your 2.5 minutes start now.
Thank you very much. Our opponents would like you to believe that fossil fuels is the silver bullet that will solve all our problems. This is not the case. Physics has said no, and we cannot go against physics. Today, if I said that gravity does not exist and we climb a tall building and jump off, well, physics will take over from there. Here are the facts about fossil fuels. The power of the sun. Today, all the technology we know on solar cells can only convert 26% of the sun's energy. Wind, 45%. This is an intermittent form of energy. We need on all the time. As my colleague said, we have a huge youth population that will require urbanization, they will need housing. We are not going to build that on renewable energy. Tesla have built a factory for batteries in Nevada. In order for them to build enough batteries to power the United States for one day, it'll take them 500 years. Listen, we had 500 years of colonization. We're not going back to 500 years. In addition to that, we know that in order to make one EV, one vehicle, we need 200 metric tons of dirt to be dug up. And guess where that dirt is being dug up? In the Congo. The same place you heard about cutting down the forest so that we can produce oil. In this case, it will be minerals. I'm not even counting about what a wind farm can do. If we are going to produce 100 megawatts, a wind farm that powers 75 homes, we need to dig up 30 metric tons of iron ore. We need 50 metric tons of concrete and 900 metric tons of non-recyclable plastic. Is that coming from wind and solar? I don't think so. If you look at solar, for example, you will need 150% what I've just told you about wind. You will need rare earths, you will need cobalt, you will need copper. Africa is going to become the quarry of the earth with nothing coming out of it. We need to expand our fossil fuels so that we can develop our Africans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Now over to Thuli Makama on the against side of the motion. When you're ready, your 2.5 minutes will start now.
The science that we all know illustrates that the carbon emissions from oil, gas, and coal in the world's atmosphere, it's already going to take us beyond the 2 degrees of warming. And we all know that the current target that has been agreed is 1.5 degrees. So if this is true, then digging and expanding the fossil fuel industry is going to cause us to get to the tipping edge of a calamity, for the world and for humanity. And fossil fuels have been around for decades. Look at the example of Nigeria, where there's been exploration for over 60 years. They have not delivered on the promises of development. The development where development has happened, it's to the multinational corporations and the northern governments. They have had the major share of profits from that. And just go out there and look. The statistics tell us that the profits that actually remain in Africa are about 60% of the total profits from the industry. 60% after all the havoc that extraction and expansion of fossil fuel causes in the continent. The myth about jobs, that the industry creates jobs, is not true. When you look at the total extractive industry in the continent, it only provides for 1% of jobs. So the industry is not our hope for jobs for the continent. Instead, figures tell us that the innovation and technology that is to be developed for renewable energy delivers almost 2 2 to 5 times as much jobs as what the current industry is doing. So no profits, no jobs. What do we have if we expand the industry? We will have stranded assets that mean more debt, but also mean stranded cleanup for communities and also for loss of jobs. Look at the example of the Niger Delta again. Cleanup is being attempted right now, and it is not a good sight. Fossil fuels are bad for our health. Look at the research that tells us that pollution in 2018 actually caused about 1 in 5 deaths. So think about that. Who gets the energy access? The energy in Africa that is the fossil fuels that are being extracted go into pipelines that are crisscrossing the continent for export to northern economies. So it's not for local use.
Thank you. Thank you, Thuli. Thank you both. You can now return to your teams. And if the last pair of debaters would please come to stand up to the podium. We have Her Excellency Hakima El Haiti, a UN high-level climate champion for COP22 and a former Minister of the Environment of Morocco, who is representing the for side of the motion, and Zipporah Berman, Chair of Fossil Fuel Treaty and Director of Stand Earth, who is representing the against side of the motion. Over to Hakima El Haiti for the for side of the motion. When you're ready, your 2.5 minutes will start now.
Thank you for having me. Let me ask you a question. Did we agree the Paris Agreement? Yes or not? Yes. 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 So we are not negotiating the Paris Agreement anymore. And what I'm telling you, I'm saying yes, under the framework of the Paris Agreement. That means under the principle of common and shared responsibility. Yes, for using fossil fuel, our resources, our minerals in the south, in the developing countries, because there is a huge gap of development to reach and to close. We have 600 million people who have no access to energy in Africa, 1.2 billion people who have no access to energy in the world. That means no right to development, no dignity, no right to dignity, no right to security, no right to peace, because this is what energy means for me. So, yes, for the principle of common and differentiated responsibility, yes, for using our own resources, because this will lift millions of people out of poverty. This will create development. This will open new perspective for our youth. And we are, in the global south, the biggest reservoirs of solar energy in the world. We can produce renewables, export renewables to the north, to the developed world, who has the responsibility, the historical responsibility of the CO2 emissions, who are creating all this disaster in our countries, and we can export green energy to them to faster their green transition. We are ready for a green transition when it's time to do it for the developing world and from the south. So let's ask them to stick to their commitment, to bring the 100 billion on the table, to develop the framework for loss and damage, and especially to stop subsidizing fossil fuel and to reorient this money to build development and to build the green transition. Thank you very much.
Please, Her Excellency. Thank you very much. And lastly, we turn to Zipporah Berman on the against side of the motion. When you're ready, your 2.5 minutes start now.
We agree on many things. We agree on some of the principles of equity and justice that we should be seeing in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. I think what we don't agree on is the systems that need to be built right now to both address energy access and to ensure that we continue, that we fight climate change and that we get back to a livable planet. That's not in concentrating the political influence that gets stronger the more that you give them a foothold. I'm talking about the fossil fuel industry because climate change and climate policy and solutions are complicated. But what's not complicated is that 86% of the emissions that are trapped in our atmosphere today and causing the floods and the droughts and the fires come from three things. They come from oil, gas, and coal. The science is clear, as the UN High-Level Expert Advisory Group noted in its recommendations yesterday in defining net zero. We cannot continue to expand fossil fuel production or infrastructure, and in fact, we need to begin to decline and decommission existing infrastructure. The UN Production Gap reports that we are on track to produce 120% more fossil fuel production than we can ever burn, or it will burn us. And in fact, the top oil and gas companies, the top 20 oil and gas companies currently have plans to build 930 billion more oil and gas infrastructure between now and 2030. It is not a transition if we're still growing the problem. Demand will decline as more countries put in place policies like zero-emission vehicles. We need to look at the trends as we talk about development. We also need to look at where the money is. These companies are making record profits, billions and billions and billions of dollars. Yes, we need to find the money. Let's ask the wealthy countries of the global north to put the money on the table. Let's call for a global windfall tax. If we tax just the largest companies 10%, that would be $37 billion this year alone. We need to start building the world that we want. It isn't going to be easy. It is going to be difficult. But the time for transition is now. The fact is that we cannot afford to build more of the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Now that all the speakers have argued their positions, we're going to turn it over to the commentators for their critical reflections and questions on what we have just heard. If you'd like to join us on the stage, please. Please welcome them as they share their critical reflections for 2 minutes, one by one, at the lectern. And then after that, the debate teams will have 2 minutes to deliberate in order to build their arguments. We're going to start with Dr. Johan Rockström, who is the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Dr. Rockström.
Thank you. The Paris Agreement, which we all agree here we stand by, was a major breakthrough. Finally, the world agreed we share one atmosphere. We had actually not agreed on that before. Now we agree that every country in the world needs to follow the scientific path towards a fossil fuel-free world economy roughly by mid-century. That is the necessary path shown by the IPCC, but it has to be done in a just transition. So just like the positive motion team very rightly pointed out, there is a common and differentiated pathway here where the rich nations must reach net zero much, much earlier, between 2030 and 2040, while developing countries can go slower and land safely somewhere between 2050 and 2070. There is needed finance, we've agreed on that, to help developing countries to do this in a justice-based and equitable fashion. It's interesting to see that when you think about mobile phones, many developing countries jumped immediately from no telephone mobility right into very modern mobile-based telephone. Now we know that the fossil fuel era has come to an end. We're at the beginning of the end of the old era. If you want to be part of the future, you want to invest in the new modern technology, and that is renewable energy. The positive motion team actually pointed that out very clearly, that one of the key issues is how do we deal with intermittency? Well, the intermittency in the tropical regions of the world is really to build about the big excess energy we have, which is sun. The solar energy is such an enormous excess. To use that as a way of producing hydrogen as a storage facility and make many of the developing countries as export countries can be one of the major basic development pathways for a large part of that energy transition. When it comes to the issue of risk, we know that the risk of passing 1.5 will hit back very hard and most on those most unequitably hit countries in the world. So if you really want to have an energy transition that is just, you also have to think about mitigation in a very serious way. Time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rockström. Our second commentator is Renata Koch-Alvarenga. Over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you. Common but differentiated responsibilities. We've heard that term quite a lot in both sides. And it's interesting because it's a term that came from this concept of the UN Climate Convention in 1992. 2022, here we are, still discussing it, still not sure of what that means for both sides. So what is energy transition? More jobs and development? Is it lifting people out of poverty? Is it both? I've heard both sides here. With the fourth side for fossil fuel expansion as a prerequisite for just transition, I heard that children are dying because of the lack of electricity in Africa, for example. But are you arguing that by emitting more greenhouse gases is going to make children die less? Is that the effect of greenhouse gases? Is that the effect of fossil fuels? I wasn't sure about that. And when you think about the potential of renewable energy, given the state of the world right now, having more energy is the end goal. When you think about having high potent energy or weak energy, what is the end goal when we look at the climate crisis, when we look at the vulnerable countries? So I would encourage you to think about that in your next statement. And then for the against side, I didn't really get the plan. What is the plan to move away from fossil fuels? I understand the potential of renewable energy, but the how isn't really clear. You say that fossil fuels haven't really delivered development, but I don't know if that's true. If you look at the US and all countries around Europe, I think they've developed quite a bit, right? So I would love to hear more reason about how we can confidently reach this expansion for more sustainable roads. So overall, how does thinking about the damage that we've done for the Earth, how does continuing that pattern for the fourth side help us in any way? And we know that the science is clear for the against side, but how can you tell small island states, developing countries, that they can't develop like the other countries did, that they have to stop and it's unfair to them? Thank you.
Thank you, Renata. And lastly, we turn to Wanjira Maathai of the World Resources Institute in Nairobi.
Thank you. A lot has been said by my colleagues. I just want to address some things that I think each of you should consider. We did fly here, but the aviation industry is the fastest innovating around alternatives. So there's a lack of finance needed for expansion. Where would that finance come from for fossil fuels? It's the same finance that's required. Consider that. We also need to consider that it is crucial that we do not lock Africa and vulnerable countries that need a just transition with stranded assets. Consider the issue of stranded assets. Mineral exploitations for Africa do not bring the resource curse. That is absolutely true. It is not the minerals, it's the leadership. 5% of grid, the demand, those of you who are arguing for, the demand for fossil fuels in Africa, for example, is extremely unprofitable. 5% of the grid customers are responsible for 70% of the demand. It is not a profitable industry to consider. The power of the sun was mentioned. Andrew, only 26% converted, but there's also geo, wind, and hydro. We have a mix. Tesla, of course, you mentioned a good example. Tesla is not the only manufacturer. Look at the entire body of innovation around this sector. Those in the against, look at the cost of capital. It is absolutely not profitable at the moment to consider renewables because at the cost of capital for Africa today, absolutely unprofitable. And no future for fossil fuels at 1.5, but Africa is only at 3%. So whose fault is it? Who bears the burden? Africa should be able to go forward. And then, of course, Nigeria's fossil fuel is not helpful. But that's not because of the fossil fuel, is it? It's because of the leadership. Look at Norway. Stranded assets, but today we are spending much more on fossil fuels than we are on climate solutions. Signals are not aligned.
Thank you to our commentators for those very pointed reflections that really help, I think, to draw the threads between the very spirited arguments we've heard on both sides of this debate. Now, both teams can take a couple of minutes to huddle among yourselves. During this period, the teams are going to discuss and to decide on their teams about who will represent their side of the motion for the final round of rebuttal. This final round is their last opportunity to address the judges, comments and concerns, as well as to convince the audience of their argument. We are now going to play a short video as the debaters deliberate. Debaters, your time to deliberate starts now, and I'm going to turn over to Stephen, who's going to introduce the video. So, on the for side, have you decided who's going to debate in the final round? Have you decided who's going to debate? It's for you, please. Hakeem El Haiti, thank you. Please come to the podium.
This is a very challenging exercise. 1 minute. Please, don't begin here. I didn't begin here.
Hakeem El Haiti, you have 1.5 minutes on the clock to present your final argument. When you're ready, please start.
Yeah. Let me begin by saying, imagine that tomorrow, the whole developing world, I'm not speaking about the emerging world, the whole developing world developed green energy everywhere, zero fossil fuel. We will not save the world because we are not the one who are producing the CO2 emissions. We don't have the historical responsibility. We are not producing CO2 emission. Look at Africa, for example. 3% of the CO2 emissions. And we are waiting for the money. We don't want to wait for the money. We want to give perspective for our youth. We want to give perspective for our women. We want to develop our country. We don't want it for development and charity. And we can save the world because we have this reservoir of oil, and they are asking for our oil, of solar, they are asking for our solar. We are already developing renewables everywhere in Africa. I'm coming from a country where the renewables are representing 50% of the energy mix. So please, yes, we are developing renewables, but we need to develop our country, and don't ask us, don't stop to wait 2 measures. We need to develop. This is climate justice. This is the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much.
Hakima, if you could wait at the stage, please. Thank you very much, Hakima, for that spirited summing up. Now we will turn to Mohammed Adaw on the against side of the motion. If you're ready, Mohammed, your 1.5 minutes starts now.
Friends, just let's remember that this motion is about expansion. This motion is not about turning the taps off tomorrow. We're talking about shifting so that the world can be on a safer, sustainable future. The question you should ask yourself when they talk about money, particularly 100 billion, the global south every year has a net financial flows of 2 trillion to the global north. So let's not be distracted with peanuts. We have an opportunity for us to actually take our destiny in our hands and chart a future that is safe and sustainable. We don't want to double down on an extractive path that is going to lead to destruction. What we have is an opportunity that is actually going to save life. Today, 1 in 5 people will die from pollution as a result of fossil fuel extraction. In the Horn of Africa, every 36 seconds, we're losing a life to drought. Is that the world we want? Every ton of carbon dioxide we actually stop will help save life. Now, the challenge you have is, do we want a scramble for African gas, just like Berlin divided our continent, for the scramble of our natural resources? Or do we want to send a clear message? Don't gas Africa, don't gas the global south. Now, ask yourself, What is the opportunity for a safe, brighter, sustainable future? Is it through expansion of fossil fuels, or is it through renewables, where we take our destiny in our own hands?
Thank you very much, Mohammed. You may both return to your teams. Thank you very much. We now turn to the most important part of the evening. You, the audience, are going to decide the winner, considering the arguments you've heard through this session. If you think the team for the motion, fossil fuel expansion is a prerequisite to a just transition, had a more convincing argument, please clap now. That definitely feels like a stronger response than we had at the start of the session. If you think that the team against the motion, fossil fuel expansion is not a prerequisite to a just transition, if you think that the team who are against the motion, in other words, who believe that fossil fuel expansion is not a prerequisite to a just transition, please clap now.
This is complicated. This is very complicated.
I'm not sure.
I think we're gonna
go again.
Do it one more time. Just one more time.
Okay.
Okay.
So one more time, if we can have those who believe that the for side of the House had it this evening, please clap. That is especially impressive, seeing as the for side seem to have now been reduced to 2 people. And if you believe that the against side of the motion had it tonight, please clap again.
I'm walking over to this side of the room, and I tell you why, because at the start, when we put the motion up and we did the clapometer at the beginning, there was a reason for that. And the fact that there was so little applause for those arguing for the motion, I think, and now seeing how much they have, how convincing their arguments have been, the fact of the matter is, we do need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. We do need to pay for the subsidies for fossil fuels need to go away. But it's very difficult to imagine if we turn off fossil fuels right now, how we can have a just transition. So this is a very complicated debate. We have tried to capture some of that complexity here. And I really want to thank all of the debaters for having the courage to come and do this. And also, I'd like to thank our commentators for giving the advice and the counsel. So thank you very much. And lastly, thank you, the audience. You have participated in exactly the way we had hoped. I really appreciate it.